The various wings of the Catholic world, the progressives, the liberals, the centrists, and even the trads and conservatives, all see the new pope as one of their own. It's an institution that predates the invention of left and right. I think on traditional sexual morality, he's on the right. On climate change and immigration, he will be a thorn in the side of MAGA world. He hasn't tweeted much in recent years, but the few tweets you have are directed polemically against Vance. I think it must be heartbreaking. It must be painful.
He is the 267th Pope, but the first American. Leo XIV, until last week, Cardinal Robert Prevost, a Chicagoan who has spent much of his career in Peru, is already being seen by many as some kind of response to Donald Trump. He has barely made any public pronouncements as Pope, but predictably there is already something of a heated argument developing around him. A Twitter account that appears to be by him has been critical of the Trump White House, particularly on the subject of immigration. So, what is the truth about this softly spoken man? Will his elevation raise friction, as Steve Bannon, for example, predicts, between the papacy and the United States? Well, we are joined by our very own Sohrab Ahmari, who, as well as being US editor of UnHerd, is himself a believing Catholic, and also something of an expert on those various factions within the world of MAGA that probably have quite strong views on this. So we are really lucky to have him, and welcome to the show, Sohrab.
Thanks, Freddie. Good to be back.
Before we get back to our regular programming, a brief word from our sponsor. Did you know that when your metabolism is running smoothly, you feel the difference everywhere? More energy, better sleep, clearer focus. If you want a better handle on your health, you should try out Lumen. Lumen is the world's first handheld metabolic coach. You just breathe into it and it shows you whether you're burning fats or carbs and gives you daily guidance based on your unique metabolism. Each morning, I take a breath test and instantly get personalized tips on how to fuel my body, whether it's what to eat, how to train, or how to recover. It even helps me understand how stress or sleep might be affecting my metabolism. What's really cool, Lumen adapts over time, even through hormonal changes like cycle shifts or menopause, so you always have the insights you need to stay on track. If you're ready to take control of your health this spring, now's the time. Go to lumen.me/unheard to get 15% off your Lumen. That's lumen.me/unheard. Thanks to Lumen for sponsoring this episode.
Let's just start by laying out the facts. So what do we know about the Pope's views so far? I mean, there's been a lot of talk about these tweets. Should we start with them? How much emphasis should we give to them? What do we know?
He actually has a pretty sparse record, which makes the tweets, in a way, all the more striking. I would say probably troubling from the point of view of the White House, and more specifically Vice President JD Vance, who is a Catholic convert and a serious Catholic as well.
So one quite relatively recent tweet by the now Pope goes like this. He quotes an article written in the National Catholic Online about this question of the Ordo Amores, the hierarchy of loves that JD Vance waded into. And the tweet says, JD Vance is wrong. Jesus doesn't ask us to rank our love for others. I want to get into that quite knotty philosophical question in a moment, but let's just lay out what else he has said.
Actually didn't tweet for several years. He was tweeting maybe up to, if I'm not mistaken, 2017, 18, 20, 21. And then there was like a lull, and then only a handful of tweets from more recent months. And they're all tend to be critical of the Trump administration, and especially over this question of immigration.
Let's call one more tweet up. He retweeted something by Rocco Palmo saying, as Trump and Bukele use Oval to Fed's illicit deportation of a US resident, once an undocked Salvadorian himself, now DC Orcs and Avelio asks, do you not see the suffering? Is your conscience not disturbed? How can you stay quiet? So that would appear to be a pretty strong condemnation of the deportation aspect of Trump's policy in any case. One more hard piece of evidence. Since becoming Pope, he hasn't said very much. Obviously, he's only had a few days to say anything. He was asked by one reporter whether he had any message for the United States, and he responded somewhat cryptically with a single-word answer, many. And in another formal message, he did talk about communicating in a way that could be interpreted reasonably, I think, as being pointed towards Donald Trump. The way we communicate is of fundamental importance, he said. We must say no to the war of words and images. We must reject the paradigm of war. Let us disarm communication of all prejudice and resentment, fanaticism, and even hatred. Let us free it from aggression. And this is the crucial part. We do not need loud, forceful communication, but rather communication that is capable of listening and of gathering the voices of the weak who have no voice. I'm sure some people in the White House would say it was unfair to say that was directed at Trump, but it seems reasonable to make that connection, I think.
You're right. I mean, that certainly applies to the way that Donald Trump and sometimes Vice President Vance communicate. It's not wrong to suggest that that's a description of how MAGA world communicates. It's interesting that the first reaction of a lot of Catholic conservatives, and especially like MAGA Catholics, was to look at those, few tweets and so on. On the whole, though, I can tell you that in a very strange way and probably heartening way from the perspective of the Vatican, both the various wings of the Catholic world, the progressives, the liberals, the centrists, and even the trads and conservatives, all see the new Pope as one of their own. He speaks to all of them in various ways. So those tweets that are critical of Trump and deportations and so on, definitely feel like they are in continuity with Pope Francis when he gave a lot of succor to progressive Catholics. On the other hand, he has notably, for example, he's made a point of speaking in Latin in his blessings, and when he appears on the palace and the balcony of the Apostolic Palace, imparting various very kind of traditional blessings in Latin. When he spoke to the journalists, he had his first kind of address to Holy See journalists. He gave them a traditional Latin blessing, benedicat vos omnipotens Deus, which Pope Francis notably hadn't done. A decade earlier, or more than a decade earlier, when Pope Francis held the same meeting, he said, I know that many of you are not Catholics and some of you aren't even believers, so let me give you a silent blessing. It was notable.
So that's evidence, if anything, of a more conservative approach.
Yes, that he's
something
saying,
to infuse the conservative end of the congregation.
I am the vicar of Christ, and I'm going to preach the Christ crucified in an explicit and unabashed way. There was a photo of him that circulated as Pope visiting the tomb of Pope Pius XII, the kind of last pre-Vatican II Pope, who's beloved by more traditional Catholics. Again, a kind of signaling to them that they are safe now, or that here's a papacy that's willing to engage with them. So he's a complicated guy. So notable things. Everyone says he's the first American Pope. That was my first reaction when I wrote for us about him. But the fact is that he took up the missionary life and went to Peru at a very young age as an Augustinian missionary, a member of the Order of St. Augustine. So he has that, what we Catholics call religious background, meaning it's not just the kind of secular priest who's out in a parish, but more religious life. And I think that gives him that sympathy for the poor, especially the poor of Latin America who are pouring over the border. On other fronts, though, he actually has sounded lots of conservative, on issues of like abortion, sexual morality, things like that. He's sounded very, very conservative notes. I mean, The Guardian ran a piece saying, his tweets are troubling progressives on these issues.
Let's just get a couple of those quotes up as well. I think that would be useful for people. So, for example, on homosexuality, in a 2012 address to the World Synod of Bishops, he criticized the, quote, homosexual lifestyle and condemned the redefinition of marriage as being, quote, at odds with the gospel. So that will be encouraging or dismaying, depending on your perspective. He also, in talking about secular culture, sounds quite kind of culture war-y on the right-wing side, where he says Catholic pastors who preach against the legalization of abortion or the redefinition of marriage have been portrayed as being ideologically driven, severe, and uncaring. Meanwhile, alternative families comprised of same-sex partners and their adopted children are so benignly and sympathetically portrayed in television programs and cinema today. So that's like a very common complaint of people on the conservative side, that secular culture is kind of progressive, leaning left, condemning of more traditional lifestyles. So basically there's something for each side from this new pope.
Here's the kind of triple issue, dividing the various issues. I mean, this using left and right when I'm describing the Catholic Church is always an injustice to the truth. It's always so much more. It's an institution that predates the invention of left and right, so it's very difficult to stuff it into those categories. But as a kind of rough rule of thumb, here goes. Here's my gut. I think on traditional sexual morality, he's quote unquote on the right. It will be much more like Pope Benedict the 16th and John Paul II, greater continuity. Not that Pope Francis doctrinally really ever changed anything, but Pope Francis could destabilize some of the practices of the church or kind of cast them subtly in a different light. I think you'll see on these issues, conservatives will be very reassured. On issues of economics, which we can get to, he's going to go down. I mean, we can get into his name, Leo XIV. He's the first Leo since Leo XIII, the Pope who inaugurated modern Catholic social teaching with its defense of labor unions and social welfare and the living wage and so on. And then on climate change and immigration, because of his global South experience, his global South sympathy, he will be a thorn in the side, I think, or could be, unless there's engagement on both sides of MAGA world.
So before we get into those really meaty topics, I feel it's just worth pausing on this theme of communication, the way he presents, because that is something that is so strikingly opposite to President Donald Trump, isn't it? He really appears to be a very modest man. His first address there on the balcony, he was almost sort of nervously or timidly reading from what appeared to be an A4 printout. There was none of the flourish of John Paul II, or even Benedict, I remember, had a little bit more seemed to be enjoying himself a little bit more on the balcony when he was first elected. There was a sense of being almost quite a background personality. And I think that will be a very interesting contrast. Perhaps two of the most visible Americans in the world will now be the most brash, and then at the opposite end, this rather meek man.
Yeah, well, I mean, President Trump is a politician, to be fair to him. However, let me just say, I mean, look, Catholics believe that this is Christ's vicegerent on earth. And one can't imagine, if the Lord were to come to our world in 2025, one can't imagine him being brash or making fun of people on social media. One has to imagine him kind of being, I'm not saying this guy's Christ at all, but, although, there's this very scandalous phrase from St. Catherine of Siena, one of the great medieval counter-Reformation saints, who says, that the papacy, the Pope as the office is this, quote, sweet Christ on earth. That's in a way a calling to popes of what is expected of them, what is expected of the office. And I think that moment that you saw where he was overwhelmed, you could tell he was kind of swallowing back tears a little bit, and the modesty that he showed, the humility that he showed. I mean, I think it is a counterpole to Trumpism and much of our whole political culture. And I think that's what the church is supposed to be, right? It's supposed to be this kind of counter witness to the way the world is, the secular world.
Right. Well, it's the meek shall inherit the earth, not the braggadocious shall inherit the earth, as I recall. So let's tackle this big, difficult question of the so-called Ordo Amoris controversy. What happened was, just to retrace it, JD Vance, just a few months ago, raised this question. He said, I'm going to quote, in a Fox News interview on January the 29th, "There is a Christian concept that you love your family, and then you love your neighbor, and then you love your community, and then you love your fellow citizens, and then after that, prioritize the rest of the world." A lot of the far left has completely inverted that. That then became a Twitter conversation involving various strange characters like Rory Stewart, the British podcaster, and eventually religious publications weighed in on what the theology of that question was. Was JD Vance right or was he wrong? Someone wrote an article saying JD Vance is wrong, and that was the one that was tweeted out by now Pope Leo XIV. What's your understanding of this theological controversy.
Let me step back a little bit. Aboriginal Christianity, historic Christianity, is a religion that took root not in isolated desert places, but in the Mediterranean world, in the commercial hubs, in the port cities of the Greco-Roman world. And, Pope Benedict, for example, had this saying in his Regensburg address where he noted that, it's notable that when Paul had this dream, it was a Macedonian man coming to say, not any other kind of man, but a Macedonian man who says, come to us, help us. Meaning that Paul, in preaching the faith, was called to the place that was this kind of multinational, multilingual empire. And then, as the sort of center of gravity in the church moves more and more toward Rome, which becomes the seat of the most important see, the Roman see. It's a church that's unfolding in the midst of a global multinational empire and takes over many of the imperial administrative forms. The Roman Curia, now it becomes a kind of church office, of course. The Pontifex Maximus, the sort of supreme pontiff, becomes the Pope. It changes them from the inside out. It changes the message that these institutions preach, but the imperial form remains. And so all of this is to say that Christianity invented universalism. It is fundamentally a universalistic religion, and the political form that comes most naturally to it is not the nation, but the empire, neither Greek nor Jew, etc., etc. So, and the rise of modern nation states was, which wasn't that long ago, 17th century, 18th century, 19th century. This was basically a kind of annoyance for the church. It was a wound for the church because it meant the splitting up of this larger universalistic concept of Christendom and its division into smaller political units that demanded greater loyalty sometimes than could the Pope himself, the Bishop of Rome. So all this was like a trauma for the church.
And I just on that, just if we're thinking about history, it does remind, for example, of the Henry VIII period, where once again you had a nationalist who was at odds with Rome because he wanted absolute power within England, as it was, and he felt that the Roman authority that's emanated from the Pope was a direct challenge to that. So these things have been kind of in tension before, basically.
In a way, we are in a world in which the nation state seems impossible to dislodge, right? The nation state has become, it's not a forever concept. It's not an ancient concept. The nation state is a modern invention. But it's one that's taken root, as artificial as it is. And we talk about it, imagined communities, the fact that Indonesia was woven together into a sense of Indonesian identity, or Italy even, right? Is this kind of all these regional identities. Only in the 19th century with the Risorgimento, a person from Naples began to think of himself or herself as being a fellow citizen of some entity that also included people from Sicily. Fine, I agree, it's all invented, but it's really taken root, and it's become a way that people organize themselves in larger scales. And so what I'm trying to say is I'm torn on this. It's the same thing that because on the one hand, I realize that Christianity is universalistic and uncomfortable with these hard national borders. On the other hand, a lot of people find their sense of political attachment and belonging in this more limited scale of the nation state. Not the individual who's too small and selfish to command our loyalty, but also not humanity at large which is too large, but kind of in the middle, the nation, my fellow Americans, my fellow Britons, and so on. So basically this tension is one that JD Vance has to grapple with. It's not as simple as, I think the Pope's right. It's not as simple as, that Ordo Amoris means my family first, then my country, then if I have any room for foreigners, because there are these bits from the gospel where, who helps who's the Good Samaritan? He's not a Jew, but who helps the stranger on the road.
On that point, I think maybe we could say a little bit more about the theology, because what you've talked about really in an interesting way there is almost the political history of Christianity and how interwoven it was with the Roman Empire. The big philosophical or theological revolution of Christianity also was the fact, or at least one of them, was that it was universalistic, that it placed in every human being some form of equal value before the Lord. There was this sense that tribal identities were no longer relevant, and you were supposed to show some form of love, or at least respect, for even people you didn't know, people from foreign countries. There are loads of moments in the Bible which indicate exactly that, reaching across barriers, the outcasts, the people who society has closed and turned their backs on. Would you agree then that it's also really a key part of Christian message?
It is, but I would say it's already there in even incipient form in the Hebrew Bible, right? The fact that you're obliged to give a break, the Sabbath break, not just to yourself, but also to the stranger in your midst. And various commandments in the, injunctions where God tells the people of God, that the people of God who were then limited to the Israelites, don't oppress the stranger in your midst and so on. You were once a stranger. And of course, in Christianity, this reaches its fulfillment with the parable of the Good Samaritan, that who is my neighbor? Someone who's not a Jew. He's, you might be Jewish, but your neighbor is not. So it absolutely is there. But on the other hand, Christianity, as it's unfolded in time, in history, in a place, has come to terms with this is our community. Even Christendom wasn't always able to span the whole globe. There was areas that were beyond its reach, and this is our border of Christendom, and beyond it are people who are different from us, and we have to come to terms with them, sometimes at the edge of the sword and sometimes through, interfaith dialogue.
But so what JD Vance was reaching for, it's an Augustinian concept, is it? The Ordo Amoris, which is a part of, I guess, early church theology, that there is some kind of hierarchy allowed within Christianity where you don't have to treat everybody with equal affection. You're allowed to love those closest to you first, and then a kind of concentric circles outward. That, I guess, is for someone like JD Vance, who both is a devout Catholic but also a national populist, that is his way of squaring them. He can be a good Catholic Christian but also a nationalistic populist, thanks to the Ordo Amoris. So to have the now Pope, who I know is not infallible on Twitter, but were he to speak ex cathedra on matters of doctrine, is literally infallible, to have the Pope say JD Vance is wrong in terms is quite a big challenge to his whole view of his role in the world.
Like I said, he hasn't tweeted much in recent years, but the few tweets you have are directed polemically against Vance. I think it must be heartbreaking. It must be painful. Without saying that Christianity or St. Augustine would then therefore approve of every single Trump administration policy, including, putting Venezuelan hairdressers into a Salvadoran gulag. There is a way to square the two. I mean, I think there's a couple of ways to square the two. The first is at the individual level. If you are neglecting your parents, right? If you're a person who isn't visiting his aging parents, is irresponsible in taking care of your children and whatever, but you say, okay, but I am helping the stranger by donating to a charity, and use that kind of love for some distant other as a way to shirk your responsibility to those who are nearer to you and have this more immediate, they impose this more immediate duties on you, then you are violating the order of love. And I think in that sense, now can you expand that into a theology that justifies every single thing that the Trump administration has done in recent months? Probably not. I wouldn't agree.
I understand what you mean. This is the idea that Vance has talked about, that sort of certain liberals or progressives seem to be kind of extremely exercised by conflicts on the other side of the world, but are neglectful of their own backyard. And that's often a populist critique. And that I can see could be an inversion of some kind of hierarchy. But the fundamental principle of MAGA, America First politics, is that the elected representatives of the United States have only a duty to Americans. And Vance says this pretty much in terms in every public pronouncement. My job is to look after Americans. So in every foreign policy interaction, there will be a negotiation, and the interests of Americans are the only consideration. He's not there to look after people outside. And, that must be in conflict with Christian teaching.
It is in conflict. I mean, there's no way to reconcile that with any notion of Christian statesmanship. It's one thing to say that primarily my duty is to the common good of my own country because that's where I have authority. I don't have authority over, if I'm JD Vance or whoever, if I'm Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I don't have responsibility over how Somalia governs its people. But there is such a thing as the global common good. I mean, human being. I mean, this is again the universality of the church. I mean, there are problems which individual nation states can't solve on their own, and that becomes a problem of the global common good. Now, climate, whether you agree with exact green policies, is one of them. Is one that if you agree on its own terms that the planet is changing as a result of our collective global action, then there's the only way to deal with that is on a global decision-making scale. So I agree with you. I mean, I think that kind of rhetoric is populist rhetoric. It goes well with the electorates and maybe understandable as a reaction to a kind of imperious transnational liberalism. But nevertheless, you're right. It cannot be squared with doctrine.
And with regard to immigration, which is the other kind of dimension of this, I guess even the Pope, probably, if pressed, I doubt he will now have this conversation because it wouldn't be appropriate for a pope to, but if pressed, would concede that you can't have completely open borders and countries can't just allow people from across the world to swoosh around in any place they want, because that would lead to chaos and that would lead to net suffering, which cannot be what the church would advocate. So some kind of controls on immigration are necessary. So that gives you quite a lot of leeway, but I would suggest it does not allow you to be disrespectful, hateful, despising of immigrants, and maybe requires you, if you're to be a good Christian statesman, to do the opposite, which is to do the very best you can to treat them with respect and even love, rather than the opposite.
Here, I mean, it's worth, again, there is this footage of then, I believe, Cardinal Prevost addressing this issue in a way that I think is a concession to the JD Vance concern.
Both the first reading and the gospel make very clear a message which Pope Francis has been hammering home time and again since his very first trip as Pope, when he went to this little community, an island in southern Italy, the town of Lampedusa, where all these immigrants continue to come. It's a huge problem, and it's a problem worldwide, not only in this country. There's got to be a way both to solve the problem, but also to treat people with respect. Every one of us, whether we were born in the United States of America or on the North Pole, we all are given that gift of being created in the image and likeness of God. And the day we forget that is the day we forget who we are. We forget who Christ has called us to be.
For the past 2 decades, maybe longer, the church has only emphasized the respect part of that, sometimes the hierarchical church. It's created a degree of tension with Christians and people generally in the recipient countries where it feels like the church isn't hearing them, like in the sense that the mass migration can be a problem, whether it means lowering wages or whether it means putting pressure on social services. If the church only emphasizes, the duty of the recipient country and not the price of that, or how, how to deal with the difficulties associated with that duty, then it becomes the message becomes too ethereal, too sort of out of touch with reality. So I was, and a lot of conservatives pointed to this footage that we just played. They said, look, he might have bashed JD Vance in some of his recent tweets, but if you listen to that carefully, the premise is that it's a problem that needs to be quote unquote solved in a way that is respectful, but solved nevertheless, meaning some other solution than just pure open borders. And again, the doctrine of the church, if you look at the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the bit about immigration is actually very brief. It says, people have a right to move. I'm paraphrasing, but accurately, but consistent with the common good. And the second half of that, consistent with the common good, has been neglected. Sometimes the church can sound like it just is a pro-immigration NGO. Like you said, it can't be that the duty to the other, to treat him humanely and respectfully and so on, must mean, such a degree of burden that it messes the common good of the recipient country. In a message like that, there's an opportunity for dialogue between the Trump administration, maybe between a lot of these kind of national conservative governments that are popping up, reform movement in Britain, Giorgia Meloni in Italy, Hungary's Orban, et cetera, to engage with the papacy, with the Vatican, to see if there's a way, I think it'd be really lovely to see a document that addresses immigration beyond just saying, that acknowledges, in the way that now Pope Leo XIV did in that clip you just played, acknowledges that, look, there's some legitimate complaints and concerns.
I mean, this is where it gets really more than just interesting and philosophical, but could actually be world-changing, in that, if it's true, and it's a big if, but if it's true that the fact of the Trump White House was part of the consideration of the cardinals when they broke their long-standing rule of not having an American pope, you can see that might well have been part of their thinking, and that someone as modest and mild as now Leo XIV might somehow soften the Trump moment. Maybe it will actually work. Because if you have people like JD Vance, who must be the most senior Catholic in the US at this point, at least in elected office, really seriously thinking about these questions, and other governments that you mentioned that present the Christian face front and center, Hungary's is another one, they have to listen to it. So on the two questions of whether they should consider the overall well-being of the world beyond their borders, and to what degree they need to treat immigrants and refugees with love and respect, there could be a shift.
And here's why I'm hopeful, is because, unlike the late Holy Father, Pope Francis, whom I love, I never criticized publicly. I think it's fair that lots of observers say that Pope Francis was not a systematic thinker. He was more of a kind of off the cuff, speaking from the heart. Pope Leo, the new Pope Leo, by all accounts, is a systematic thinker. He was a mathematics major. The way if you listen to his public statements, there's just this kind of orderliness to his thought. And so, I think it would be wonderful if, as a product of that kind of engagement, yes, there is a softening on the part of the Trumps and Orbans and Melonis and so on of the world. But likewise, the church offers a sophisticated moral and political theology of immigration that takes into account the concerns and limitations of recipient countries, the global north countries, that sort of says, okay, well, but under what conditions can deportations be legitimate? Yes, it should be conducted humanely. And I'm pretty sure it'll say, if it went into the details, that you can't send people without due process to a Salvadoran prison for life. But I think it's not crazy. It's not crazy. It's not completely against Christian moral doctrine to say that, if you're here illegally, you should go. Maybe you have another chance to apply. I don't know. But I'm saying it would be great that if the engagement and the influence kind of goes both ways, because otherwise, again, as a Catholic, I worry that the church, these men who are celibates, and who live, in this very well-guarded, opulent city-state, telling Italians in the south of Italy to take as many as come. That doesn't sound right to me. And I think it would make the church look just out of touch.
Let's talk about another big theme before I let you go, which is this idea of the previous Pope Leo. The choice of name is very significant for a new pope. And most people believe that the reason he chose Leo was a reference to the prior Leo XIII, who was a very famous and long-reigning pope at the end of the 19th century. And one of the things he was most well known for was his Catholic social thought. Was it an encyclical called Rerum Novarum of new things that is really, it's quoted a lot in the political discourse, particularly among sort of so-called blue Labour thinkers. Tell us about Rerum Novarum and what he might be pointing at with this choice of name.
Pope Leo, as you said, late 19th century, Leo XIII, and a very influential figure in the secular world because he inaugurated what we call CST, Catholic Social Teaching. And with this document, Rerum Novarum, which was a document looking at the effects of the Second Industrial Revolution, and it begins with a kind of description of what the late 19th century was like in Europe. Basically, immiserated peasants forced into squalid cities, forced to work for obscenely low wages. And, he says some few individuals amassing vast riches. Sometimes the description portion could sound like a Marxist. His proposed solution was very different from Marx. Obviously, he recoiled at the abolition of private property. He was, he says private property is the kind of natural foundation of a good, decent, ordered society, and he didn't want to overthrow the entire economic order. Rather, he proposed a kind of third way between, unrestrained laissez-faire capitalism and socialism. And that third way was there has to be a living wage, not as a matter of employers' charity, but as a matter of justice. He said there has to be a right of workers to band together in labor unions to be able to defend their mutual interests and so on. That set of ideas jibed with the European movement for social democracy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and of course also this idea of Christian democracy, which was so influential in the building up of post-war Europe. Think about the sort of Adenauer government, the various kind of continental European governments after World War II that were conservative but attentive to labor unions and so on, as a way to stave off the threat from revolutionary communism. That's the background. And so it's notable that he has chosen this name, and he has said, one of his few statements since becoming Pope, that he's chosen the name specifically because he's worried about the AI revolution. And he thinks that what we're going through with artificial intelligence now is akin to what happened with the Second Industrial Revolution, the age of the big factory that Leo XIII was responding to, and what AI might mean, he has said, I'm quoting, for human labor, human dignity, and so on. So I think perhaps the first encyclical we might receive from him, actually, instead of immigration, although I think he should address immigration in a sophisticated way, the first encyclical will be about AI. What are the ethics of AI? How should governments deal with the potential mass job losses that it might bring about, and so on.
At the very least, then, it's a signal that he intends to be more political, or at least small p political, interested in how societies are coping with very contemporary challenges and not retreating to just, theology and theory.
All the popes are political. The Catholicism is always bound up with civilization. John the 23rd was dealing with the Cold War, so he issued Pacem in Terris calling for nuclear disarmament. Pius XI was dealing with the Nazis, and so he issued an encyclical which was written in German instead of the usual Latin to condemn anti-Semitism and racism. Certainly the modern popes have always been called to respond because the church's mission is to salvation of souls, period. It's about saving souls. However, the way that the political world is organized structures how the church is able to do its salvific work. And so it can't neatly partition AI from if people are suffering mass joblessness as a result of AI, the church can't reach them, about their souls. And so it's always political.
To conclude then, I guess we are faced with somewhat of almost a compromise pope, or a third way pope, potentially. You talked about how the reference to Rerum Novarum indicates neither an ultra-capitalist nor a socialist, but someone who is trying to weave those two traditions together. Certainly when he was elected, the message coming out from the cardinals was that he was a sort of bit of a compromise candidate. Is that how we should think of him, do you think? Someone who's looking for a third way?
Yeah, a compromise, a stabilizer, an orderly mind is very helpful. You said this, I think it was a good observation. All three previous popes riffed openly when they were up on the palace first, after the Habemus Papam. They were all just he had a sheet of paper of like a written speech, and he read it carefully, gave his blessing, and that was it. That tells you someone who is very careful. And I think, again, contrast to what's happening in our politics, certainly in the United States, other parts of the world as well, where everything is so driven by passions and populist anger and so on. A voice that maybe takes into account where those passions and angers may be coming from, but speaks in an orderly and calming way. Obviously I'm Catholic, I'm delighted, but...
Well, you're painting, I guess, much more of an optimistic picture of the new Pope. So here's hoping that the version you describe is the version that comes to be. Sohrab Ahmari, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
That was our very own Sohrab Ahmari, US editor of UnHerd, and someone who is very well placed, both with deep knowledge of the Catholic Church, of which he is a member, but also characters like JD Vance and those religious components within the Trump coalition, and how they might be responding to this really quite deep push and pull on some of their fundamental beliefs. And by his account, it could actually be quite world-changing. So I thought that was fascinating. Thanks to him, and thanks to you for tuning in. This was UnHerd.